Okay, so welcome everyone to the second lecture in the series, The Two Promised Land, the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Some of you might have been listening to the conversation that I had with Nicole before we started about a speaker who presented at the Mirage Jewish Community Center last night. He was a Palestinian, Bassem Eid, who gave an impassioned defense of the Israeli position, which was rather interesting coming from a Palestinian. And in the last lecture in my series, I will talk about some of the ideas that he put forth. But I'd like to begin this lecture by summarizing some of the things that we addressed in the lecture last week. So World War II was really a watershed in the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict because of the changed circumstances that occurred at the end of World War II. By then, Britain, which was the mandatory power over Palestine, Britain was greatly weakened by the war, and it wanted out of Palestine because of the conflicts growing between Jews and Arabs. In addition, the League of Nations was defunct by the end of World War II. These Arab countries that surrounded Palestine were independent by 1945, and some of those countries formed the Arab League, which was a confederation of Arab countries united in causes that were of great interest to Arabs. Also, by 1945, there was worldwide sympathy for the creation of a Jewish state after the Holocaust. Many people came to the conclusion that there would not have been a Holocaust if there was a national home for Jews as a port of refuge from Hitler's Nazism. And by the end of 1945, the United States had emerged as the predominant power in the world. And finally, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was underway in the years following 1945. So by 1947, Britain invited the newly established United Nations to come up with a solution to the Palestinian problem. In September of 1947, the UN proposed to partition Palestine into a separate Jewish state and a separate Arab state. So if we look at this map, this is the partition plan that the General Assembly came up with, that everything in the orange color would be part of a new Jewish state, and everything in the purple color would be part of an Arab state carved out of Palestine. And the partition plan called for international control of Jerusalem. Now, this partition was supposed to go into effect when the British would pull out of Palestine, and the date set for that was May 15th, 1948. Now, when the partition plan was presented to the United Nations, it was approved by 2/3 of the General Assembly. It was also accepted by the Jewish leadership, but it was rejected by the Arabs. And the arguments that Palestinian Arabs gave for rejecting the partition plan were that, first of all, it denied Arabs the principle of self-determination, That is, they claimed that the partition plan was taking away land that was rightfully theirs, and that since a majority of Arabs lived in that land, they should have the right to determine which government should rule them. Now, in 1947, Jews owned just 7% of Palestine, whereas the UN partition plan would give 56% of that land to the new Jewish state. And that was another reason for the Arabs to reject the plan. Now, at the time of the partition plan, the Arab population outnumbered the Jewish population 2-to-1, some 1.2 million Arabs to 600,000 Jews. So when we break down the population of Palestine at that time, there was a total population of 1.8 million. 1.2 million were Arabs and 608,000 were Jews. In the proposed Jewish state, there would be 498,000 Jews and 407,000 Arabs. In the proposed Arab state, there would be 10,000 Jews and 725,000 Arabs. So these are the reasons why the Arabs rejected the partition plan. On the other hand, Zionists felt justified in claiming a Jewish state out of parts of Palestine. And their justification was as follows: that the land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. And for centuries, Jews prayed for a return to their ancestral homeland, with prayers ending with the quote, next year in Jerusalem. In addition, they argued, the Jews who emigrated to Palestine had built cities and had made the desert bloom, whereas the Palestinians who were there remained as peasant farmers. And above all, the justification for the UN plan, as put forth by the Zionists, claimed that the Holocaust made a Jewish homeland critical for the survival of the Jewish nation. Now, like so many issues in this controversy, both sides had legitimate and compelling arguments. I leave it to you to decide which side had the better case. But there were problems with the UN partition plan. The proposed Jewish state was in 3 scarcely linked blocks, as you can see. One block here in the northeast, another block along the coast, and a third block in the southern part. And they were connected by the narrowest of corridors, as you can see here and here. And Jerusalem, which was to be under international control, was situated deep within the proposed Arab state. And so in order for Jews to visit the Western Wall or other holy sites, they would have to pass through hostile territory in order to visit those sites. And almost immediately, civil strife between Arab and Jewish militias erupted following the partition vote in September of 1947, while Palestine was still technically under British control. Most of the fighting took place in those areas given by the UN to the Jewish population, that is, these areas in blue. A cycle of attack and retaliation then ensued, with each side claiming that they are just responding to the outrage of the other side. Arab forces blockaded the road connecting Tel Aviv with Jerusalem, and that left thousands of Jews in Jerusalem besieged. Now, although the Arab population of Palestine was double that of the Jewish population, the Jews were able to amass a force of some 38,000 soldiers, 35,000 in the Haganah, which was a left-leaning military organization, the Irgun, which was a right-wing military organization, had between 2,000 and 3,000 men, and the Stern Gang, which was extremely right-wing, had between 300 and 500 men, whereas the Arab forces numbered only around 20,000, with 2,000 to 3,000 men in small militias. There was an Arab Liberation Army of between 4,000 and 5,000 men, and another Arab force known as the Army of the Holy War, which numbered between 5,000 and 10,000 men, as well as between 200 and 500 local armed bands. But in total, the Jewish forces amounted to 38,000 soldiers to 20,000 for the Palestinian side. Moreover, the Jews were highly organized and extremely motivated to defend their territory, whereas Palestinians were highly fractured and poorly coordinated. Each local militia was essentially fighting on its own. The fighting between the two sides was fierce, and atrocities were committed on both sides. And all of this while the British were preparing to leave Palestine entirely. The Jewish army was able to defend Jewish settlements, and then it went on the offensive in order to break the siege of Jerusalem. Now, this map shows the road connecting Tel Aviv with Jerusalem. And in order for the Jews to secure this road, it meant they would have to attack Arab villages along the way. One of those villages was Deir Yassin. And what happened there would haunt relations between Jews and Arabs for decades to come. Deir Yassin had stayed out of the fighting. It was not on the Haganah's list of hostile villages. Nevertheless, the Irgun attacked the Arab village of Deir Yassin, thinking it was a soft target. But the villagers fought back, killing 6 Jewish soldiers and wounding 42. The Irgun then retaliated, massacring 115 Arab men, women, and children in Deir Yassin. But then Arab radio, in an effort to encourage Arab armies to intervene, it invented stories of Jewish soldiers raping women and slaughtering children. But reports of such atrocities had an unanticipated and devastating consequence. These reports, which was largely untrue, frightened Arab villagers who feared what might happen to them at the hands of the Jewish forces. And as a result, more than 300,000 Arabs fled their homes in Palestine to seek refuge in neighboring Arab countries. Now, it should be pointed out that Jewish sources also exaggerated the extent of the Deir Yassin massacre in hopes of frightening Arab residents to flee. Now, the state of Israel has never let these refugees or their descendants back to this day. And many of them continue to live in refugee camps in Gaza, Jordan, and Lebanon. Now, the issue of Arab refugees has been in dispute ever since. It's one of the most contentious in the Palestinian-Israeli dispute. The Arab side insists that Jewish soldiers forced Palestinians from their homes, and therefore Israel should allow their descendants to return and to reclaim their property. On the other hand, the Israeli government maintains that those refugees were encouraged to leave by Arab propagandists who promised them an easy return once the Arab armies defeated the Zionists. And because they left on their own accord, they should not be considered refugees, but rather that they should be considered legitimate occupants of the former state known as Palestine. Finally, the Israeli side argues that if the Arab states had not attacked in 1948, there never would have been a refugee problem to begin with. Now, recent scholarship confirms that Zionist forces did compel some Palestinians to leave, according to Benny Morris, who is considered one of Israel's preeminent historians. In his book, A History of the First Arab-Israeli War, he found that between 50 to 70,000 Palestinian Arabs were forcibly expelled from the towns of Lydda and Ramleh in July of 1948. And both of those towns were outside the area that was designated for a Jewish state by the United Nations. So it does seem that some Palestinian Arabs were forced out by Israeli forces, while others fled as a result of both Zionist and Arab propaganda broadcasts that exaggerated the horrors that awaited them if they remained in Palestine. As a postscript to the Deir Yassin atrocity, 5 days afterwards, there were reprisals on the Arab side. On April 13th, there was a massacre of the Hadassah Hospital convoy in East Jerusalem, which resulted in the death of 70 professors, doctors, students, and nurses. Now, President Truman was not happy over Israel's refusal to allow the refugees to return. But the president was increasingly preoccupied with other foreign crises. And so he eventually gave up on trying to change Israel's position on the return of refugees. The passivity of the Truman administration was captured in a public statement made in 1948 by the US ambassador to the United Nations. The US ambassador implored both Zionists and Arabs to end the fighting and, now get this, to settle the problem in a true Christian spirit. That is what the American ambassador to the United Nations said. Now, as the May 15th date for the British withdrawal approached, the armies of 5 Arab nations mobilized, threatening to crush the Jewish state in its infancy. On May 14th, the day before the British mandate would end, the Zionist leader and Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, declared the independence of a new state of Israel. Now, people wondered whether the United States would recognize the new nation. The State Department wanted to maintain good relations with Arab states, specifically because of their oil resources. And therefore, the United States State Department was vehemently opposed to Jewish independence. There were also a number of known anti-Semites in the State Department. But President Truman surprised everyone when he declared, "Hitler had been murdering Jews left and right. I saw it and I dream about it even to this day. Jews needed someplace where they could go. It is my attitude that the American government could not stand idly by while the victims of Hitler's madness were not allowed to build new lives." And with that, 11 minutes after Ben-Gurion's declaration, the United States became the first nation to recognize Israel's independence. And that was followed almost immediately by recognition from the Soviet Union. And that represented a rare instance of when the Cold War rivals, the United States and Soviet Union, voted on the same side. Now, some cynics claimed that Truman's support of Israel was only because he wanted to win Jewish votes in the upcoming 1948 presidential election. Israel's Declaration of Independence was celebrated by Jews around the world, that it represented a return to the land of their ancestors after 2,000 years of exile. But it was seen as a disaster in the Arab world, and particularly by Palestinians, who referred to the creation of Israel as al-Nakba, the catastrophe. On the day of independence, Egyptian planes bombed Tel Aviv, and the next day, armies from 5 Arab states, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, as well as a token force from Saudi Arabia, went to war with the new Israeli nation. And so in this map, which happens to be in German, you see forces invading the new Jewish state from Lebanon in the north, from Syria in the northeast, from Iraq, from Jordan, and from Egypt. On the surface, it seemed that the 600,000 Jews would be no match for the Arab nations that had a collective population of 40 million. But the Jews had superior military training, and they succeeded in raising an army of 35,000 compared to the 23,000 troops on the Arab side. Now, in time, the Jewish forces would increase to twice the size of the Arab army. The Egyptian army numbered 10,000. The Jordanian army, 4,500. The army of Iraq was 3,000. And Syria's army was between 3,000 and 6,000. Then 1,000 troops came from Lebanon. So as you can see, the Israeli forces greatly outnumbered the Arab forces, and there were 2,300 irregular forces. Now, these Arab forces were also divided by personal, political, tribal, and regional differences. And so there was very little coordination of Arab military movements because each Arab nation was suspicious of each other's territorial ambitions. In fact, the king of Jordan even conspired with Zionists to take the west bank of the Jordan River and leave the Israelis to take whatever they could of the rest, while the Egyptians aimed to seize as much land as possible from the newly created Jewish state. And Syrians coveted land in the Golan Heights and around the Sea of Galilee. And despite an arms embargo imposed by the UN in the War of Independence, Jewish forces were able to receive weapons from Czechoslovakia, from France, and from private American sponsors, who also supplied 3 bomber planes to the new Israeli state. But above all, the Israelis knew they were fighting for their very existence, and that gave them a ruthless determination to prevail. By the end of the fighting in spring of 1949, the Israelis possessed 3/4 of the territory that the UN had originally allocated to the Palestinians for their state. So this map shows the extent of Israel after the armistice agreement in 1949. And as you can see, it's much more extensive than the Israel that was provided for in the UN partition plan. Now, during the War of Independence, Egypt seized the coastal strip of Gaza, and Jordan took the West Bank, while the city of Jerusalem was divided into an Israeli western part that you see here, and the eastern part of Jerusalem, which was under control by Jordan. Now, if we look at this balance sheet of the War of Independence, Israel lost 6,373 lives, while Palestinians lost between 3,000 and 13,000, and Arab armies between 3,700 and 7,000 lives. There were 10 Jewish communities that were lost in the War of Independence and 400 Palestinian communities. At the end of the war, there were 10,000 Jewish refugees and 710,000 Palestinian refugees. So clearly, the greatest price in the 1948 war was paid by Palestinians. The conflict destroyed 360 Arab villages and 14 Arab towns. And some 70% of the Arab Palestinian population had become refugees. Almost 200,000 Palestinian refugees were crammed into the Gaza Strip. 280,000 refugees were located in the West Bank. Another 200,000 refugees were in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. And the name Palestine was virtually erased from all maps after 1948. The fighting between Israel and the Arab states ended with a ceasefire and an armistice, but without a peace treaty. And that meant that Israel was technically still at war with its Arab neighbors, even after the armistice. The borders were set where the fighting ended. And those borders were known as the Green Line because the ink that was used on the maps to draw the border was in green. Now, the Arab states continued to reject the legitimacy of the new Jewish state. They considered it the creation of Western imperialism. And so, after the War of Independence, they imposed a total economic boycott against Israel. Now, to most Jews, the War for Independence was a smashing success, but it did come at a cost, with more than 6,000 Jews killed and 30,000 wounded. But despite the establishment of the State of Israel, that was not the end of the story. To quote Winston Churchill, it wasn't the end. It was not even the beginning of the end, but it was the end of the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The new Israeli state was 21% larger than the country that was proposed by the UN partition plan. It had more defensible borders than it would have had under the partition plan, although the military would have preferred even more defensible borders. The population of Israel was, by 1949, at 771,000, with 170,000 Arabs. So 82% of the population of Israel was made up of Jews and 18% made up of Arabs. The new country's central democratic body was a 120-seat parliament called the Knesset, and that includes both Jewish and Arab representation. Now, there is enormous political diversity between the Jews in the Knesset, as well as between the Arabs in the Knesset. The new government featured a multi-party system, which at first was dominated by the Labour Party. And its first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, who dominated the government in the first 15 years of Israel's existence. The Knesset also elected Chaim Weizmann to the largely honorary position of President of Israel. Military service was deemed compulsory for all non-Arabs in the new Israeli state. And to encourage as many Jews as possible to return to their homeland, in 1950, the law of return granted citizenship to all Jews willing to return to Israel. And that doubled Israel's population by 1952. The population increased from 771,000 in 1949 to 1.2 million in 1951 and 1.4 million in 1952. Some Jews came from Europe, but many of them were Jewish refugees who had been expelled from Arab countries such as Iraq and Morocco. Some 14% of all pre-1948 Arabs remained in Israel and eventually became citizens. And those Arabs in the Israeli state largely lived in the northern part, in these areas in green and dark green. But they were regarded with suspicion. And until 1966, the Arab population in Israel was governed by martial law. The Arab people were limited in their ability to assemble and to travel without permission. They remained at the lower end of the economic spectrum with very little political influence, and they were regarded as traitors by many Arabs living outside Israel. But while the standard of living of Arab Israelis was below that of most Israelis, it was way above that of Palestinians living in refugee camps in Arab countries. This is a map showing Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan. Now, for security reasons, Ben-Gurion refused to allow Palestinian refugees to return to Israel. They were regarded as unwanted intruders by other Arab nations, and in general, they were forced to live in deplorable circumstances. Because of the large influx of refugees in Jordan, Palestinians outnumbered native-born Jordanians 2-to-1. Now, the king of Jordan at that time, King Abdullah, tried to Jordanize these Palestinian refugees by offering them Jordanian citizenship and by banning all Palestinian organizations and political parties. But in fact, native-born Jordanians never fully accepted the Palestinian refugees. The Palestinian refugees were encouraged when Gamal Abdel Nasser took control in Egypt in 1954. Nasser spoke of uniting all Arab countries in an effort to drive out the Zionists and return Palestinians to their home. But Arab nationalism could never overcome the tribalism and regionalism that divided and continues to divide the Arab world today. During the first half of the 1950s, there were border raids into Israel by Palestinian guerrillas known as FATAH, and these raids came mostly from Jordan. In September of 1955, Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran, which cut Israel's access to the Red Sea. So by closing the Straits of Tiran, Israeli ships leaving the port of Eilat could no longer gain access to the Red Sea. And then in 1956, NASA nationalized the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal was an international waterway, is an international waterway located inside Egypt, but it was owned by British and French shareholders. And when NASA nationalized the canal, he intended to keep the tolls for Egypt so that Egypt could build the Aswan Dam. But by nationalizing the Suez Canal, NASA angered Britain and France. And that led Britain and France and Israel to attack Egypt in what became known as the Suez War in November of 1956. Now, in this Suez War, Israeli forces swept across the Sinai Peninsula to within 50 miles from the Suez Canal. British and French paratroopers were sent to fight in Alexandria, Egypt. But at that moment, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev threatened nuclear war against Britain, France, and Israel. And that put the United States in a bind. Should the United States support its allies, or if the United States did support Britain, France, and Israel, it would lose the support of people in the third world, because it would seem as if the United States was supporting imperialist aggression. And so Eisenhower pressured the British and the French to withdraw. Now, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute was complicated by the intrusion of the Cold War into the Middle East. Soon after the end of World War II, the Soviet Union began probing at the edges of the Middle East, which prompted the United States to increase its own involvement in the region. While the Soviet Union initially supported the creation of Israel, it soon abandoned hope of winning influence with the new Jewish state, and it began to side with the Arabs. Now, again, the Eisenhower administration wanted to keep the Arab states friendly so that those states would resist Soviet influence, and that by having friendly relations with Arab states, it would secure the access of Western nations to Middle Eastern oil. And it was for that reason that the United States sided with Egypt in the Suez War. And by doing so, it forced Israel to relinquish territory it had gained in the conflict, largely the Sinai Peninsula. Now, President Eisenhower kept Israel at arm's length, largely because he didn't want to antagonize the Arab states. But under President John Kennedy, US-Israeli relations became much friendlier. Kennedy repeatedly assured the Israelis that in the event of any future Arab attack, the United States would guarantee Israel's survival and security. The US increased economic aid to Israel, and it agreed to provide Israel with weapons that the Eisenhower administration had denied to Israel. Weapons such as the anti-aircraft missile known as the Hawk. Now, there were two main areas in which President Kennedy hoped to influence Israeli behavior. First, he wanted Israel to agree to the return of Palestinian refugees who had fled during the 1948 war. As of the early 1960s, 750,000 Palestinians remained in refugee camps throughout the Arab world. And as long as that problem continued, Kennedy believed, no real peace in the region would be possible. And the Soviet Union would continue to exploit Arab grievances against the West. A second area of concern for President Kennedy was that he wanted Israel to refrain from developing nuclear weapons. Since 1960, the Israelis were constructing a large nuclear reactor in the town of DIMONA in southern Israel. The Israeli government claimed that the DIMONA reactor was intended solely for civilian purposes, but the size and type of the reactor caused many observers to suspect that the facility was also intended for producing nuclear weapons. To this day, Israel refuses to confirm that it has nuclear weapons, although it seems very likely that it does. Now, the United States adopted an even more pro-Israeli position under President Lyndon Johnson, who for the first time agreed to sell Israel weapons that had offensive capabilities. Now, for the Palestinians, who one day hoped to establish their own state, it was a time of increasing hopelessness and despair. Israel was militarily untouchable, and it was powerfully backed by the United States. The Soviet Union opposed Israel in order to win favor with the Arab nations, but it was not willing to take any action in support of Palestinians. And NASA seemed unwilling to go beyond pro-Palestinian pronouncements. Although in 1964, NASA did help to create the Palestinian Liberation Organization, known as the PLO. And in 1966, he helped to create the Palestinian Liberation Army, or the PLA. But those bodies were strictly controlled by Arab nations, not by the Palestinian people. More significantly, a group of Palestinians living in exile in Kuwait formed a new nationalist organization called FATAH, which is an Arab word for conquest. And this new organization, FATAH, was under the leadership of YASSIR Arafat. Whereas Egypt and other Arab states told Palestinians to look to Arab countries to solve their problems, Fatah argued that only Palestinians could solve their problems, and that the only way to achieve a Palestinian state was through armed conflict. And so, by the mid-1960s, Fatah had launched at least 100 attacks into Israel. By the spring of 1967, NASA again began to saber rattle against Israel. He spoke of a negotiated peace if the Palestinians were allowed to return to their homeland, while at the same time, Egypt was amassing troops along its border with Israel. NASA whipped up crowds with strident and bloodthirsty rhetoric of driving the Jews into the sea, promising to wipe Israel off the map, as depicted in this cartoon. And in the spring of 1967, NASA ordered UN peacekeeping troops on the border between Sinai and Israel to leave. Now, if we look at this map, these red dots represent the location of United Nations emergency forces. These were UN troops put in place between Israel and Egypt after the SUEZ war. There was also a peacekeeping force in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula and Sharm el-Sheikh. But in the spring of 1967, NASA ordered these UN forces to leave. Now, when Jordan's King Hussein signed a military pact with NASA on May 30th, 1967, Israel felt it was time to act. It seemed clear to Israel that the Egyptians and Jordanians were planning to attack Israel. So on June 5th, 1967, Israel launched a surprise attack on Egypt, destroying its air force on the ground. The Egyptian army was all but defenseless against the Israeli ground assault in the Sinai Peninsula. And after Israel attacked Egypt, Jordan entered the war on Egypt's side, as you see on this map, the military thrust from Jordan into Israel. But Israel quickly defeated the Jordanian army and took control of East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Israel then turned its attention to Syria. The armies of Syria had invaded in 1967. They were defeated, and Israel seized the strategic Golan Heights. By the time the war ended, 6 days later, Israel had tripled the amount of territory under its control. So as we can see from this map, the land that Israel occupied after the 1967 war is the land that you see here in dark brown: the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Sinai Peninsula. Now, the war did not increase the size of Israel proper, although East Jerusalem, which had been formerly under Jordanian control, was assimilated into Israel proper. But the territories that you see in dark brown were not annexed by Israel, but rather were militarily occupied. Now, there were two reasons why Israel did not want to incorporate all the captured territory. First, by keeping the West Bank and Gaza as zones of military occupation, it kept open the option of a future deal by exchanging land for peace. Secondly, if all the conquered territory had been absorbed into Israel, then the large Palestinian populations in those lands those Palestinians would then become Israeli citizens. They would become entitled to vote, and that would have given Palestinians more influence than Jews in Israel. If Israel were to incorporate those territories and deny Palestinians the right to vote, then that would have been tantamount to creating an apartheid state. And so the Israeli government decided that it would be better not to annex and incorporate the occupied territories after the 1967 war. Nevertheless, as a result of its victory in the Six-Day War, the government of Israel came to administer 323,000 new refugees in the West Bank, 100,000 Palestinian refugees from the Golan Heights, and 38,000 refugees from Gaza. Unlike 1956, when Eisenhower forced Israel to withdraw from Egypt, President Lyndon Johnson merely called for a ceasefire, which meant that the fighting should stop immediately and each country's forces would remain where they were. That allowed Israel to remain indefinitely in possession of the Arab territories it had seized. Now, the Six-Day War had a powerful impact on Middle Eastern politics. The war dramatically changed US-Israeli relations. It established Israel as the premier military power in the Middle East. And as a result, the United States came to view Israel as its most strategic asset in the Middle East. The war also strengthened Soviet relations with Egypt and Syria. Although the Soviet Union had encouraged the war that ultimately brought disaster on the Arabs, and although the war seemed to demonstrate that Soviet arms were inferior to the arms that Israelis possessed, after 1967, Arab states, particularly Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Algeria, were even more dependent on the Soviet Union to resupply the arms that they lost during the war. And they were dependent on the Soviet Union for diplomatic support. The war was also devastating for Nasser and his pan-Arabist movement, his movement to unite all Arab states. The 1967 war was a blow from which Arab nationalism would never fully recover. And Nasser would spend the remaining 3 years of his life desperately trying to regain the territory and honor that he had lost. The war also had an equally devastating impact for Palestinians. Some 200,000 Palestinians in the West Bank fled to Jordan, and that only added to the refugee crisis there. After 1967, Palestinians became increasingly convinced that collective Arab military action was hopeless. Arab armies failed in their objectives in 1948 and in 1967. And so Palestinians came to believe that the only way for them to regain a Palestinian state was to take matters into their own hands. And so the 1967 war added impetus to the development of the Palestinian Liberation Organization under the leadership of ARAFAT. The war dramatically shifted attitudes towards the Jewish state as well. Before 1967, much of world public opinion sympathized with Israel. In general, the world tended to see Israel as David in its war against the Arab Goliath. But the overwhelming Israeli victory in the Six-Day War confirmed that Israel was the dominant power in the Middle East. And so increasingly, many in Europe and elsewhere began to regard Israel no longer as a mere survivor nation, but as a ruthless conqueror. And the plight of the Palestinians were increasingly drawing international attention. The United Nations adopted UN Security Council Resolution 242, which called for Israel to withdraw from the territories it occupied in the 67 war. And it called for Arab states to recognize the legitimacy of Israel. It took Israel 3 years before it accepted Resolution 242. But Palestinian leadership rejected Security Council Resolution 242, maintaining that any concept of peace for land was preposterous, since they regarded nearly all of Israel as stolen territory. Whereas the basis of the Arab-Israeli conflict prior to 1967 was the Palestinian refugee question and the Arab desire to destroy Israel. But the Six-Day War created a much more complicated situation. Issues resulting from the war now included Jewish settlements in the disputed territories, as well as sovereignty over the city of Jerusalem. The war also caused deep divisions within Israeli society. Some, including ex-Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, called for a withdrawal from the occupied territories, believing that these territories would become a millstone around Israel's neck. Most Israelis hoped that the occupied lands could eventually be returned in exchange for peace from Arab states. But a third group, the right wing of the Zionist movement, considered the expanded frontiers essential for Israel's future security. And so they wanted to keep and annex the occupied territories. And a much more extreme element was made up of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews, who regarded the 1967 triumph as an opportunity to recapture land which they said was given to Jews by God in biblical times. That is, Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews wanted to restore Samaria and Judea to the Israeli state, into what they called Greater Israel. Now, the first Jewish settlements in the West Bank appeared in June of 1968, with many, many more to follow in the occupied territories. So here is a map of the West Bank, and those blue dots represent Israeli settlements or Jewish settlements. And these settlements split Israel's labor movement from the Zionist movement. The labor movement opposed Jewish settlements in the West Bank, whereas Zionists endorsed it. And all of that complicated any possible future peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Israel adopted a carrot and stick policy towards Arabs in the conquered lands. The carrot was to give people in Gaza and the West Bank a large measure of self-government. Goods were allowed to pass freely between these territories and Israel, and Arab workers were permitted to enter Israel without any hindrance. On the other hand, Israeli security forces cracked down against Arab attacks. It imposed curfews, it held suspects without trial, and it bulldozed homes of families involved in anti-Israeli activities. Now, following the 1967 war, Palestinians became increasingly convinced that collective Arab military action was hopeless. And once again, that the only way for them to regain Palestine was to take matters into their own hands. And the PLO, under the leadership of Arafat, increasingly adopted violent tactics to achieve its aim of restoring a Palestinian state. No figure in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was more controversial than Yasser Arafat, from his uncertain beginnings to his mysterious death. He was born to middle-class Palestinians in Cairo or in Gaza, depending on which version of his autobiography you read. He was trained as an engineer. He served in the Egyptian army and was working in Kuwait when he founded FATAH in 1959. Fatah's reputation climbed rapidly after the Six-Day War. By 1969, Arafat was elected the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now, between the PLO, which was an umbrella organization, there emerged groups such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and Islamic Jihad. Now, all of these groups competed with Arafat for leadership of Fatah. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine specialized in airline hijackings in the 1960s and 1970s. In these hijackings, they offered to exchange passengers for the release of Palestinians in Israeli jails. The first hijacking occurred in July 1968, when an El Al flight was hijacked and flown to Algeria. In the 1970s, the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine was responsible for 8 skyjackings, including the much publicized daring Israeli commando rescue in Entebbe in Uganda. Now, such hijackings often provoke ferocious Israeli reprisals. After 1967, Fatah and the PLO moved their headquarters to Jordan. By 1970, their presence grew so powerful and prominent that it threatened the government of Jordan's King Hussein. Palestinian militias began to flout Jordanian law. And so in September of 1970, King Hussein sent his army to remove these militant Palestinians. And that threw Jordan into a brief civil war in which 3,000 people were killed. In the end, Palestinian fighters were forced to flee to Lebanon. And so they referred to this debacle as Black September. During the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich, a Palestinian group calling itself Black September killed 11 Israeli athletes in one of the most publicized and most vicious terrorist attacks against Israel. And that concludes the second lecture. Next week, we will pick up with yet another war between Arab states and Israel, the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And so at this point, we will open it up to your questions or comments, and Jerry will moderate these. So if you have a question or comment.
I don't see anything in the chat, but you're welcome to unmute yourself or wave your hand if you need some help unmuting with your questions.
I have a comment or question.
Go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead,
We hear
Harold.
you, Harold.
I'd like to ask Dr. Schwartz, didn't YASSIR ARAFAT conclude some kind of an agreement at Camp David, which if it had been enacted, if it cooperated and followed through, could have led to some sort of a peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israeli? Do you recall that?
No, in the Camp David agreement in 1978 was between Sadat and Begin. I think you are thinking of the Oslo Accord, which was concluded between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, but that was in 1994.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Okay.
There is a question in the chat. Gail wants to ask, why didn't they divide the country in half, Israel and Palestine?
Well, that might have made some logical sense, but the UN partition plan tried to divide the country into a Jewish and Palestinian, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state that would incorporate where most of the Jews lived and where most of the Arabs lived. The feeling was that if you split the Israel just into a northern half and a southern half, that would be opposed by the Palestinians, since the Palestinian population was twice as large as the Jewish population. So the UN was trying to please both sides. In the end, it pleased the Jewish side, but not the Palestinian side.
Thank you. I don't think there's any other questions. I see some people have their thinking caps on, but not sure if there's any other questions. Otherwise, we will, oh wait, there is. The UN recognition vote of Israel came, wait a minute, I missed this. There's one that I just missed. Okay, well, I'm gonna go this one. I'm a little confused about occupied territory. Came in as two things, I think. Oh, here it is. Okay, let me just see. Okay, this is the first one. UN recognition vote of Israel came after US and Russia recognized it.
Yeah, the UN, when the United States and the Soviet Union recognized the state of Israel, they did so as part of a UN vote. So the General Assembly ultimately voted, and 2/3 of the General Assembly voted to recognize the state of Israel. And the United States and the Soviet Union, their votes were recorded in the General Assembly. So when the UN vote came up, the United States and Soviet Union were the first two countries to recognize Israel.
Okay, thank you. And another question was, I'm a little confused about occupied territory and its meaning in light of the fact that some Jews feel this is their rightful land and not occupied as a foreign oppressor. Who uses this term, occupied territory, and what do they mean?
Okay, that's a very interesting issue. The Israeli government has not officially annexed the West Bank, nor did it officially annex Gaza. And so, because those areas were not annexed, they were militarily occupied by Israel. So that's where the term occupied territories come from. Now, there are those who take exception to the term occupied territory. They feel that these lands rightfully belong to Israel by virtue of military conquest. But because Israel has not officially annexed these territories, they are referred to as occupied territories. What other way would you refer to those territories if they are not going to be officially annexed to Israel? So that's the justification for referring to them as occupied territories. And by referring to them as occupied territories, that leaves the possibility of using those lands as bargaining chips for a general Arab-Israeli peace in the future.